Okay, so now we're going to talk about. I call this chapter the human condition, but it's partly what we sometimes call continental philosophy, which is the idea, which is kind of started in France after or around World War II. But the beginnings of this kind of philosophy go back a lot earlier than that, and people begin it in different places. But I decided to begin it with Kierkegaard, who was around the 1800s, 1700s type. So he was a bit earlier than what I was talking about, but he was very influential with those later philosophers who became what we kind of now call the existentialist and more broadly continental philosophy. So Kierkegaard was a very staunch Christian, which a lot of the later philosophers were not. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But basically, he argued that we don't reason ourselves into existence. We exist and then we decide what existence means for us. So Descartes took rationality as primary and Kierkegaard didn't. He was also against the idea that we talked about last time when we were talking about virtue ethics, that there's sort of a one nature for humanity. He and the later existentialists that came after him didn't like that idea. There was part of what's very attractive about existentialism to people is the idea that we can sort of make our own way and that we don't have a lot of predestined ways that we are or things we have to be. There was a lot of ideas among Christians, but also non-religious people about the idea of sort of predestiny or what we're supposed to be, as we saw with Aristotle and Plato. And the existentialists really were against that. And weirdly, Kierkegaard was too, even though he was very, very Christian and thought, we were created by God and all this and that. But he started this idea of, or at least for continental philosophers and the philosophers that came after him, I mean, this idea did not begin with him, but he was influential in spreading this idea of this focus on the individual. So being part of a group makes people feel like they aren't responsible for their actions, he says, and that it encourages what he calls untruth. So he thinks that individuals must think and decide for themselves what their lives mean and what they ought to do. So he also had this idea that each person individually should search for the truth by themselves. Now, he did think, again, that God was integral to this process, but he also thought that we shouldn't just follow the crowd. He says the crowd might seem powerful since there's safety in numbers, but in the end, we can't really find the truth except by ourselves with God. So we should not just follow other people around, which is kind of strange in a way because you think about sort of Jesus doing that with the Sermon on the Mount and that sort of thing. But for Kierkegaard, he thought that the real way that Jesus liked to preach and more often did work was with individuals. At least that's his opinion. So he thought that that Jesus didn't really want us to just sort of blindly follow him, which kind of works with what you find in the Bible, the New Testament. So part of the reason he thinks that we sort of fight against this idea and that we want to follow the crowd is because of what he calls dread. And for him, this is kind of the fear that accompanies this idea of our individuality. So people don't like to confront who they are, or more importantly, the fact that they have lots of decisions that they could make of ways to live their lives or freedom. So the awareness of our freedom as individuals he calls dread. And he doesn't think it's a bad thing despite the name. So for him, dread is this sort of lack of direction or this realization, again, that we have the power to make decisions. Fear, he says, has a specific object, like you might fear flying or you might fear a lion, but dread is the fear of the unknown. So we dread our freedom because of the unknowability of it, the fact that it could lead to anything, that we can make choices and these choices have consequences. So one of the analogies he uses is the cliff. He says that if we stand on the edge of a cliff, we feel dizzy, but it's not because we're at a height. It's because that dizziness is sort of the feeling that we could jump and we don't know what we might do, and we don't know what the consequences are of what we might do. So that's the sort of dread, is this fear of freedom in a way, and fear of the unknown. So it's kind of like fear, but again, it's different. So part of this idea of dread and part of the idea of freedom becomes with responsibility. So we have guilt and responsibility that go along with our freedom, and that's where the dread comes from. So it's this idea that we have power and the ability to act, but also that our acts have consequences that we will be responsible for, and we can't always anticipate. So this is the fear of the unknown and the fear of being responsible. So how does God come into this? Well, the dread also comes from the necessity of relying on faith in our actions. And some people talk about that it says Kierkegaard's leap of faith, but he didn't ever quite put it that way. Though he did say that we have to depend on God in some ways, and we don't know whether we have found God at any moment. We just have to have faith that we have. So we have to have faith that things will work out, and faith that God is actually there for us, even though we can't really verify that in the same kind of way that we might be able to verify other things. So the leap of faith is the idea that, okay, we take this dread, we know we have this dread, but then we sort of give it up to God in a certain kind of way. That's what people like to say nowadays. He didn't really say that, but the idea that we trust in God even though we can't see God or really know God in a direct sort of way. So this is the leap of faith that people talk about with Kierkegaard. So again, despite the fact that most of the existentialists we think of who came after Kierkegaard were not really Christians, still they were influenced by his ideas, especially the idea of individual responsibility, freedom, pursuit of the truth, without the influence of the crowd. So you'll see these kind of themes as we go through this chapter reemerge in different kind of ways. And that's why I thought it made sense to begin with Kierkegaard, because he set some of these foundational ideas. Again, all the time, we have to remember that Western philosophy didn't exist in a vacuum, and that there were things that came before, and often from other countries, that don't get acknowledged as much as they should. So again, these ideas are not totally new. It's just that the way he put them and where he wrote them gave access to the people who then came after, who called themselves existentialists. And we'll start to talk about some of the other figures in existentialism next time.